Good morning, everyone. I love the lyrics to that song, In Meeting, We Are Blessed. It is indeed a blessing for me to be here with you. As you heard, my name is Dr. Tameka Hobbs, and I have the privilege of serving as Associate Provost for Academic Affairs and the founder of our Social Justice Institute at the only historically black university in South Florida, Florida Memorial University, your neighbors up in Miami Gardens. Additionally, I really am wearing the hat today as the chair of the board of directors for the South Florida People of Color. And again, it is a blessing to be here. I really enjoyed all of the service so far. I have Reverend Tom, thank you, especially the meditation that got me in the zone. And then Alex came along and stressed me out with lyrics and rhythm. I was really challenged in that moment. I was hoping that Reverend Tom couldn't hear how out of tune I was. The rhythm was not working. I was trying really hard. But beautiful, beautiful in sound and beautiful in meaning. I want to thank you for everything that you do. I was coming into the building today, I was reflecting on what I realize now is a very lengthy history of connection that I've had with the Universalist Unitarian churches where they exist. First in Tallahassee, when I was working for the John G. Riley Center and Museum of African American History and Culture. Some of the very early supporters of that institution as it was getting off the ground 20 years ago came from the UU Church. More recently, I have had the chance to work with your branch up in Fort Lauderdale, which is the base of the Black Lives Matter Broward movement. Got some really exceptional people, met some really exceptional people there. And as I came into the space today to see the Black Lives Matter signs outside and inside, it just was a continuation and consistency of what it means to be a part of a group like this. So I just want to thank you. I want to thank this denomination. I want to thank this congregation for the way that you show up. I took a note when Reverend Tom was speaking earlier. He described this congregation as a brave, curious community of thinkers and doers. And I think that is so beautiful. And it gives me honor to be here with you today. So I am, you should know, the granddaughter of a Baptist preacher and a historian. I don't know if anybody read the fine print, but you could have set yourself up for a really, really long sermon today. But lucky for you, I don't really like to speak very long in public, and I definitely believe in being efficient, and so I won't trouble you too long. But the more I contemplated the reason for my being here today, the more excited I became about being able to address you around the theme of breaking down what divides us. And reading and listening to the words that were lifted up earlier from Paloma Callow, and the reading and this invocation around telling whole stories, engaging one another's healing, as well as another's pain. As we talk about telling radical truths and exhibiting abundant compassion, those were spot on for the work that we do with the South Florida People of Color. As you heard in the introduction, we're a nonprofit organization dedicated to eradicating racism and breeding healing between people of different backgrounds, especially addressing racism and the specific format of anti-Blackness where it manifests itself. Ronnie and I talk all the time. I want to acknowledge Ronnie Bennett, who's our hardworking executive director, and my second boss. I tease her. I have to report to the university president, and I have to report to her. But it was her vision that got us along this road, and we talk a lot, and being in this sanctuary and absorbing everything as I prepared today reminded me that much of what we do with South Florida People of Color is very much like a ministry as well. It's about coming together, learning, healing, working towards change, working towards a society that is inclusive and beneficial to more than just a few. And so in many ways, there is this kinship in study and in doing the work. But going back to the words of Kahlo, when we talk about telling whole stories, that's something I know a little bit about as a historian. Much of my work around the African American history experience has been really dealing with those stories in the margin and bringing them into the center. Histories and things that people rather not know, and documenting them and writing about them and lecturing about them. And this is especially true of my area of specialty, which is lynching and racial violence. These are stories that people would rather not know about because they conflict directly with the nation of laws that we claim that we are. Understanding lynching and racial violence in this country tells us a different story about America than we usually tend to want to acknowledge. But it's in telling this whole truth that we get towards something that is communal. It's only in telling those truths that we can acknowledge, that we can begin to heal and then move towards something different. And so that was what was coming up for me as I was going through this. But I also recognized through the work and the lens of South Florida people of color and through what you are calling forth today in your congregation and in your church is that this work of radical truth-telling calls for at least three different things. You have to have people who are willing to tell the story. And that is the role that I most often find myself in, both professionally as a historian and personally as a Black woman raised in the South who happens to be of African ancestry. Telling these stories is important and impactful. Secondly, you have to have healers, people who are facilitating and helping to maybe birth these new understandings, guide these energies, because it is fraught. If it was easy to solve these things, we would have done it a very long time ago. But there is a role in this work for healers and for facilitators. And last but not least, you have to have people who are willing to not only listen, but to become actors, to activate after they have the understanding. That is how we begin to do the work of change. That is something that, as a part of South Florida People of Color, and as the founder of the Social Justice Institute at Florida Memorial University, that I am personally dedicated to. So when I go back to the theme of today of breaking down what divides us, and this theme that Kahlo lifts up, what I wanted to start with today is just an affirmation of a radical and painful truth, and that is confirming for you that racism sucks. Confirming for you that racism is real and that racism sucks. It's important to lift that up because I think that if this is not your walk, if this is not your life, it is very easy to overlook. But what I can say to you is that racism has warped my life from the very first moment that I was informed that my Blackness was viewed by others as a reason for them to treat me less well than they treated others. And that began as a small child. And I also should qualify that because that was racism made explicit to me. There were many other things at play in my childhood that I would only know once you take a psychology class in college that were at work as well. When we talk about the images that are uplifted, that celebrate whiteness, that preference whiteness, and also images and messages that denigrate, criminalize, and other Blackness. Those things were a part of my world as a child, are still a part of our world. We've made some movement, but those elements still exist. When I think about the impact of this racism, both explicitly, when I think about the impact of it historically, it is real and it is deep. We often talk about people who are first generation in college, being in higher education. That's a very important constituency that we deal with. Here in South Florida, especially being first generation of an immigrant, I have a distinction as well in being the first generation, my brother and I, and my family, never to have attended segregated schools. And I think that deserves to be named because while I am first generation and without the barrier, especially of educational segregation. I've been able to achieve a terminal degree, a PhD. I do not, however, think that that makes me exceptional. I don't, because I knew my grandparents, Cleo Grimmage and the Reverend Freeman Grimmage Jr. Cleo Grimmage, because of the circumstances, racial and economic of her life, only completed the 8th grade. My grandfather, for the same reasons, only completed the 4th grade. But Freeman and Cleo were two of the most hardworking people that I've known, and dedicated their entire lives to earning honest livings for the benefit of their children and their children's children. My grandmother, in particular, was a brilliant woman. She channeled her brilliance into her craft, which was sewing. She was a seamstress in my town. She tried to teach me, but I'm kind of a big picture girl. Details escape me, so that put us on a collision course for much of my youth. But I often think about her and her potential, both as a woman, as a black woman, as a woman who had different ability when it comes to mental capacity, what her life might have been if not for segregation, if not for racism. It is these things that get lost when we talk about the scope of race, the impact of race, and the legacy of racism. It is very easy for us to sit in today's America and say that I'm not actively doing anything and I'm not actively victimizing people, that it's there for them if they want it. But when you do that, you discount what's been lost, all of the opportunity, all of the education, all of the income, all of the investments that might have been if it had not have been for the barriers, the very real barriers of racism. I think about the on block in my youthful life. I'll come back to this story, but I was 5 years old. I was taking a dance class in my hometown of Live Oak, Florida, the other part of Florida that people think about Florida. They think about palm trees. They think about down here. I grew up in the other Florida, closer to Georgia, with the oak trees and the pine trees, and many of some very different attitudes about race. But I took dance class. I loved dance class. And the way that our teacher instructed was that each time we met, another student would have an opportunity to lead the class. And little Tameka was a leader just like Tameka, big Tameka. Couldn't wait for my chance to be in front and to lead the exercises. I fantasized about how well it would go, how perfect my instructions would be. It was my time to shine. And the day finally arrived, and I stepped in front of my classmates and began going through our warm-ups. And it was then that I noticed that a couple of my classmates were not moving along. They just stood still. And it frustrated me, right? This is my big moment. I've been looking forward to this. And I think at some point I had an outburst towards them, and I said, why aren't you following along? I'm giving you instructions. It's my turn to lead. You should follow. And I can remember as clear as yesterday, their response to me is that I was black, and that because I was black, that they did not have to follow what I was doing. I was 5 years old, and I remember that crystal clear. I did not have the words to express to my mother, and I don't think my mother had the tools to know how to guide me through that moment. I quit dance after that. I still love to dance, Ronnie can tell you. I think I'm pretty good. But when I talk about the impact of racism, I offer that example as just a small one of the diversions that are caused in people's life because of these attitudes. I quit. I've quit other things because rather than deal with the pain of the racism that I would face, I'd rather stop. I'd rather find another way. But who taught those girls that attitude? So young. We were all so young. But they were so clear and so dug in and so adamant about what their whiteness meant to them and also what my blackness meant to them. So again, when I talk about what racism has meant, that it is real and that it is sucks. I will tell you in that example that I just gave, it's caused me to quit, it's caused me to leave. Sometimes it's caused me to shrink. Sometimes it's caused me to hide. Sometimes it has forced me to overcompensate and strain to prove that I deserve to occupy the places that people say that I don't. Generally speaking, as a black person in America, I undergo a near constant state of anxiety and apprehension about the way that people are interacting with me. And now my two African American sons, one who's 25, one who's 15, both of whom are exceptionally tall. Genes are interesting. But it also, their height, I do realize, makes them a target. I wonder often in my own life and in the lives of other black people, the bandwidth, what could we do with the bandwidth that is preoccupied with our black existence, if that energy could be channeled into other places? There is a liberty, a freedom that comes with not having to carry that particular weight. I think that James Baldwin, the famous writer and thinker, said it best when he said, to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be enraged nearly all the time. Those words were said by him, written by him back over 50 years ago, but they still resonate even today. Part of what we do as a part of South Florida People of Color is that we engage people. We create environments, we can create containers, as we call them, that allow people to come together and exchange. And it was actually in one of those exchanges really early on, back in 2015, when the nucleus of this group was forming, that I really stumbled upon these discoveries. It was in those spaces of a personal storytelling, telling the scope of my life, telling my personal and family history, describing the painful instances that I had experienced as a black woman, and then also realizing the patterns of behavior that I had engaged in order to avoid those feelings. I had an epiphany. I really did not, until I was having a conversation in one of these spaces, recognize that I had a pattern of behavior, that I had shaped my life and career specifically in black institutions. Most of my career, I've vacillated between working in African American cultural museums and historically black universities. I did it, number one, because I'm a lover of black history and culture. That has been my healing as I have continued to educate myself and educate others as a remedy to some of the anti-blackness that I consumed as a youth and that is still very much a part of our society today. But it was only in sharing that I recognized that this also was a coping mechanism, that it was an escape for me, that these places that celebrated black life, history, culture, and education were a refuge for me that I sought out as a way to try to avoid the pain that I had come to know as a person of color in this society. And the person who heard that story is one who I want to uplift to you today. Her name was Francie Peak. She was part of that conversation. And she shared that epiphany with me because it was in talking with her and sharing this story, number one, that I realized that I don't think I had quite packaged it in quite that way until that moment. But she was also impacted as a white woman who didn't know anything about the black experience or that intimately. And it was in that moment that we really began a friendship and a relationship, a collaboration that continued to work in the South Florida People of Color. This is especially important because just a few weeks ago, on August 1st, we lost Francie when she lost her battle to cancer after 3 years. She battled with cancer for 3 years. I've known her for 6 years. But in those 6 years, we had built a friendship and a relationship. And I had a privilege of watching her grow as an ally in this work that we do. in South Florida people of color. And so I'd really like to dedicate my comments today to Francie and lift her up as an example to all of you as we consider the work that can be done to break down these barriers. And I have 6 things that you can do to be like Francie. The first thing that I observed in Francie is that she constantly was learning. She recognized that there was so much that she didn't know about the Black experience, that she just became a consumer. She became a student of the Black experience. And that is part of where our connection lied, because she was an undergraduate history major as well. And so my lectures, my writing, my thinking, it became a place for us to bond. And it really was, that's how I found my place in the South Florida people of color, is as a history educator. I built my career thinking that I would be teaching Black history to Black kids like me because they needed it. But in this space, in the spaces created by the South Florida people of color, I realized that white people, brown people, other people needed to know Black history too. And it was there that Francie and I really began to share and exchange all the readings that we went through, Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race by Debbie Irvin, White Rage by Carol Anderson, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, Dream Hoarders by, I think Richard Reeves is his name, The Color of the Law by Richard Rothstein. These are many of the books that we uplifted and studied in the course of our work in South Florida people of color. And Francie was such a student. She took notes. She called me with questions. We had dialogues. She was really committed through these books and also through the conversations of trying to learn and to fill the gap. Because it's only when you do that that you can have a foundation of understanding that leads towards empathy, that leads towards change. So when I think about Francie, I think about someone who was constantly learning. The second thing I will share with you that I observed about Francie is that she rejected fragility. And white fragility has become a bit of a buzzword. For some, it has a negative connotation, but it does accurately describe what can sometimes be a knee-jerk reaction for people who are not used to having difficult conversations about race. Because it is so difficult, because it is so painful, because it is associated with feelings of guilt, people tend to reject it, to run away, to fight against it. But you can't get anywhere like that. Going back to the text that started with us, you have to listen, you have to sit in the space if we're ever going to begin to heal. And that's what I saw with Francie. In our small groups, sometimes our bigger groups, Francie got it wrong sometimes. And sometimes I had to, we had a relationship, I could talk to her and say, hey, you said this, and you're forgetting about these other factors. And she could listen, and she could take that in. We also worked in our groups and our gatherings even today to build a space where people can come and make mistakes, and through those mistakes learn about the assumptions, false assumptions they may be making about people who are different than themselves. What I continue to see in Francie, though, is not only did she reject fragility, but she began to coach others along the way. We recently, just this past week, together took one of our monthly meetings and dedicated it to sharing memories about our friend Francie. And another one of our members shared a story about Francie and being out to dinner with her. And through the course of the dinner, an African-American family came in to be seated in close proximity to where the two of them were sitting. And this one friend said that she grabbed for her purse. In her mind, she was just going to move her purse to make room for the people that were entering. And she recalled that Francie said to her, like, hey, wait a minute. What you just did could be considered a microaggression. To which, she was kind of floored. She was flabbergasted. In her own mind, her only intent was to move her bag. But Francie, gave her another perspective that for many African Americans, what that says is that you assume that they want to take your purse, that your purse is being threatened by their person. And that, for me, you know, you never can know a person fully, right? But in our collective sharing, there were these rays of light that were shown through this prism that helped me to see the full spectrum of who Francie had become in the course of our work. She was consistent in her work, not only of rejecting fragility for herself, but bringing others along. So number 1 was learning constantly. Number 2 was rejecting fragility. Number 3 was respecting Black leadership. Respecting Black leadership. And this is important because our organization is founded by a Black woman. I, in my role, have helped to lead this group. It's primarily a volunteer organization. But because of the way that racism works, implicit, explicit bias, when we come together in arenas like this, there can be the natural knee-jerk reaction that I know best and I know more, and I'm going to insert myself and I'm going to push, and this is the thing that we need to do. And that often happens when we have interracial collaborative spaces. But Francie was one, again, through her education, through her demeanor, who was adamant about how much space she took up. She constantly pushed Ronnie, she pushed me to foreground our ideals and to lead. And she supported us in that work in a way that was incredibly beautiful. And something that deserves to be replicated because, again, going back to the realities of our society, we know sociologically that so few of us have friendships across the color line. We interact with very few Black people. It's even rarer that you have Black people to whom you report, Black people who are in positions of power. And that can be a very fraught thing. I don't think we need any other example than President Barack Obama and the reactions that we heard from people around us to a Black man holding the highest post or office in the free world. That alone, his race alone, in many people's mind, made him undeserving of the post, of the respect that came along with the post. That's a very high-ranking example, but it is replicated throughout our society. But in working with Francie, we found an ally who was willing to come and contribute and support this Black-led organization and encourage us along the way. And that was very important. It may seem minor, but it is and was very important to us. But that relates to the 4th point that I want to make about Francie and what she was able to do, and that is contribute to the work. Francie came and gave everything to this organization, from setting up chairs, to baking banana bread, to making me feel good about eating her cookies in our morning programs. She said, you know, I was like, banana bread makes sense with my coffee, but I don't know about the chocolate chip cookies. Francie said, Tameka, they are breakfast, they're morning circles is what she called them, that I could have a morning circle with my coffee and everything would be well. She did everything. She, even though she studied history as an undergraduate, she was an entrepreneur and ran a self-will development company, and so had an incredible mind for process. And she would help guide us through process and planning our events and all of the details. I was so impressed with her. She put us through the paces as we got ready to put on our programs. I still use some of the templates that she provided to help us get organized. She was just such a glue and such an engine to the work, but she was willing, in her dedication to eradicating racism and supporting the work that we did, she did everything. She brought her whole self to the work. Even as she got sicker, she just continued to double down on that. She helped to lead our Black History Month celebrations and coordinating them. It was a lot of work. Ronnie had other stuff. She was like, look, this is a bear. I can't do it. Francie filled the gap. I had projects that I was working on. I took on a new role as an administrator, but I still had this project here. Francie jumped in, and she began transcribing letters for me to help further my research along. Didn't have to do that, but she was just vastly interested and wanted to support. But it all helped us to build this organization and to do the work. And it was incredibly, incredibly important. I also want to call out the fact that while Francie did let us lead, I loved it when she transformed into Bossy Francie. And she would take on Ronnie. She made Ronnie do the right thing a lot of the times. She was very adamant in 2017 that we reignite our Unity 360 community race dialogues. Again, Ronnie had other priorities. She wanted to do other things, but Francie on those calls would say, we've got to do this. This is the lifeblood of our organization. This is how we bring people in. This is how we get the work done. And she convinced us. She brought us kicking and screaming, and we had some really stellar programs in 2017, but that was because of Francie and her dedication to this work. I have two more bullet points I will share with you. The fifth point I wanted to share in thinking about Francie was the importance of intersectionality. Our organization is primarily focused on anti-Blackness, but we knew that there are specific challenges that come with being a woman. That is kind of where we all kind of had some common ground and common struggles. Francie was also a lesbian, and it was through her that I learned more about that walk and that way of life and the particular struggles that come with it. In her work, I saw her advocate for women, advocate for LGBTQI+ folks, and advocate for Black people in a way that was really lovely and inspiring. Through Francie, I've expanded in my understanding of what it means to be a queer person in America, and the fact that some of the barriers that they face are very similar to the barriers that other groups have faced. It has helped me to become a better ally to the queer people in my life and to stand up for them in ways that are affirming to them, to make sure that I'm practicing the use of gender-neutral language and pronouns to make space for people who are different than myself. So intersectionality, recognizing the commonality of different and related struggles in order to move us all forward, was again something else I think of when I think of Francie. And then last, not least, and in summation, when I think about Francie, I think about someone who is an active anti-racist. It's not enough just to say that I'm a good person, that I'm not actively inflicting these barriers on people, that I'm not creating disparities. The only thing that matters is if you are actively digging in and doing the work and trying to push the needle in a different direction. And that's what I observed in watching Francie. Whenever she had a chance, she tried to do business with Black-owned businesses. It was on her radar. That was something that she tried to do, to use her capital, use her cash to move in that direction. When she decided to wind down her business, she intentionally looked for a person of color to pass that business on to mentor, to train, and expand another person, a person that might normally not have that same opportunity. Even as small as when she would travel, she and her wife Gigi would travel around, and she would tell me about how she intentionally sought out the Black History tour of whatever city or whatever experience they were having, again, as a dedication to trying to expand her own knowledge base, but also to seek out and acknowledge this special experience of people of color. So to recap, when I think about Francie and the ways that she grew and acted during her final years with us, she learned constantly, she rejected fragility, she respected Black leadership, she contributed to the work, she was intersectional, and she was an active anti-racist. And that part is really important. When I think about Francie, I think about someone who was the embodiment of allyship. And coming back to the theme of the talk today, breaking down what divides us, if there's any powerful way, one of the most powerful ways that we can do that is through allyship. And allyship is not like a badge. It's not something that you get like a trophy. It is a demeanor. It is a way of life. And when I think about Francie, that is really what I think about, someone who had become dedicated to allyship and was demonstrating it until the very last moments of her life. And we have seen that allyship be on display, most especially last summer during the protest after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. I would say, as someone who's often pessimistic about the state of race relations in America, I was inspired by what I saw, because what I saw in the streets in every state and around the globe last year, historic numbers of protest, was allyship. These were not just black people in the streets. There was people of all different ethnic and national backgrounds who were in the streets standing up. And we had a great success, and when we look at the court decision that came out against Derek Chauvin, I don't think we would have had justice in the courts in the way that we did if we had not have had protest in the streets. I will also add that that is unsustainable. We cannot have massive protests every time that there is an injustice like this just to get a legal victory that should have been taken for granted. The other thing I will observe is that as a historian, when you look at the national advancements that have been made in our history towards the inclusion of black people, none of them would have been possible without allyship. I don't care if we're talking about abolitionism and anti-slavery, if we're talking about the civil rights movement and the folks who joined hands to make that possible. Any major movement forward for black people in this country has been brought about through allyship. We are in another moment where we can have another breakthrough, a deeper breakthrough. I'm hoping for a longer lasting breakthrough if we can continue to uplift the values of allyship, like demonstrated by my friend Francie, who I've been telling you about. But I will also warn you that many of the failures and the limits of these past breakthroughs have failed and faltered because of the limited interest, short-term interest of our allies. In order to achieve the long-lasting change that we know we need in our country, it's going to take people who embody, who live, who inhabit allyship as a lifestyle. I want to conclude with a Bible verse that really speaks in my mind to the spirit of active anti-racism. It's from the book of James, in the 2nd chapter, beginning in the 14th verse. And it says, "What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Depart in peace, be warmed and filled,' but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." Faith without works is dead. Anti-racism without action is also dead. Thank you for listening today. I hope my words have landed with you. Be well and be blessed. Thank you.